The screen fades from black to reveal a glittering chandelier, its crystal droplets catching light like frozen tears. Soft jazz music plays as elegantly dressed guests mingle with champagne flutes, their laughter echoing through marble corridors. Then suddenly, the music distorts, slows down. The camera pushes through the crowd to reveal a young black woman in a simple but dignified dress, her hands being forced behind her back. Metal handcuffs click into place. Gasps ripple through the crowd. Smartphones rise like a forest of glass, every lens pointed at her humiliation. Her face remains calm, but her eyes betray the storm within. The officer's voice cuts through the silence, dripping with contempt and authority. And then, footsteps. Powerful, purposeful footsteps echoing on marble. A voice that makes everyone freeze. 5 words that will change everything. The officer's face drains of color. His legs tremble, and the unthinkable happens. This is a story about power, prejudice, and the moment when assumptions meet reality. This is a story about what happens when someone judges a book by its cover and discovers they've just humiliated the daughter of the most powerful man in the state. This is a tale that will make you question everything you think you know about respect, dignity, and justice. Stay with us, because what you're about to witness is a reminder that in a single moment, the tables can turn, and the truth always finds a way to surface. Welcome to African Tales, where we bring you stories that don't just entertain, but transform the way you see the world. I'm your storyteller today, and we're diving deep into a narrative that has become legendary in certain circles, whispered about in law enforcement training sessions and shared across social media as a cautionary tale about the dangers of prejudice. Before we begin, I want you to think about a time when someone made an assumption about you based on how you looked, where you came from, or what you were wearing. Think about how that felt. The sting of being judged before you even opened your mouth. The frustration of being seen as less than what you are. Now multiply that feeling by 100. Add the humiliation of being accused in front of hundreds of people, and you'll begin to understand what happened on that fateful evening at the governor's charity gala. This story isn't just about one woman's humiliation and one officer's mistake. It's about the systems that allow such moments to happen. It's about implicit bias, the assumptions we carry without even realizing it, and how those assumptions can explode in our faces when we least expect it. Today's tale will take approximately 30 minutes to unfold, and I promise you, every minute will be worth it because embedded in this narrative are lessons that could change how you interact with every stranger you meet for the rest of your life. The story teaches us 3 crucial lessons that we'll explore together. First, never let your prejudices cloud your judgment, because the person you're dismissing might be far more important than you imagine, and even if they're not, they still deserve respect. Second, dignity and composure in the face of injustice often speak louder than anger and can create more powerful change than any outburst ever could. And third, when given the opportunity for revenge, choosing grace and education over humiliation creates lasting transformation rather than just satisfying a momentary desire for payback. These aren't just abstract concepts. These are principles that played out in real time during the incident we're about to explore, and they're principles that have rippled outward, affecting policy changes, training programs, and thousands of individual interactions in the years since. So settle in, open your mind, and prepare yourself for a story that begins with an act of cruelty, reaches a climax of poetic justice, and ends with a lesson in humanity that we all desperately need to hear. Our story begins on a warm evening in the state capital, where the elite and the powerful have gathered for what should have been an evening of celebration, charity, and hope. Little did they know they were about to witness a moment that would be talked about for years to come. The Grand Meridian Hotel stood like a beacon of elegance against the evening sky, its facade illuminated by golden lights that made it seem almost ethereal. Tonight was no ordinary night. The annual Governor's Charity Gala was the social event of the season, where the state's most influential figures gathered to raise funds for education initiatives across underprivileged communities. Luxury vehicles lined the circular driveway, each one more impressive than the last. Valets in crisp uniforms rushed between gleaming Mercedes, Bentleys, and Rolls-Royces, while photographers positioned themselves strategically to capture the arrivals of senators, business moguls, and celebrities. The red carpet seemed to glow under the camera flashes, and the air buzzed with excitement and self-importance. Inside the grand ballroom, crystal chandeliers cast prismatic light across tables draped in ivory silk. Centerpieces of white roses and golden accents adorned each setting, and the subtle fragrance of expensive perfumes mingled with the aroma of gourmet cuisine being prepared in the kitchen. A string quartet played classical music in one corner, their melodies weaving through conversations about stock portfolios, political campaigns, and exclusive vacation destinations. The guest list read like a who's who of power and privilege, each attendee carefully vetted and confirmed weeks in advance. Security for the event was extensive, perhaps excessively so. Officer Marcus Davidson had been contracted to oversee the security team, a role he took with utmost seriousness, though some might say with excessive zealousness. Marcus was a 15-year veteran of the police force, a man who prided himself on his ability to spot trouble before it started. He stood near the entrance in his perfectly pressed uniform, his eyes scanning each arrival with the intensity of a hawk watching for prey. To Marcus, security wasn't just about preventing incidents. It was about maintaining order, about ensuring that only the right kind of people occupied spaces reserved for the elite. His team had been briefed thoroughly. Check invitations carefully, watch for anything suspicious, and above all, protect the integrity of the event. What Marcus didn't realize was that his own biases were about to become the very threat he was supposed to prevent. The evening was proceeding flawlessly, exactly as planned, but beneath the surface of champagne toasts and polite laughter, a storm was brewing that would expose the ugly underbelly of assumption and prejudice. Amara Okonkwo stepped out of her modest sedan in the parking area designated for staff and volunteers, a deliberate choice that spoke volumes about her character. At 28 years old, she possessed the kind of beauty that didn't announce itself with fanfare, but revealed itself gradually, like a sunrise. Her skin was a rich, deep brown that seemed to absorb and reflect light simultaneously, and her natural hair was styled in elegant twists that framed her face with quiet dignity. She wore a simple navy blue dress that she de-purchased from a local boutique that employed women from marginalized communities, the kind of conscious choice she made in every aspect of her life. There were no designer labels screaming for attention, no jewelry that cost more than most people's monthly rent. To the untrained eye, she looked like she might be one of the catering staff or perhaps a volunteer coordinator. This was exactly how Amara preferred it. Despite being the daughter of Governor James Okonkwo, one of the most powerful men in the state, Amara had spent her entire adult life trying to forge an identity separate from her father's shadow. She had graduated summa cum laude from Howard University with a degree in social work, then earned her master's degree while working full-time at a nonprofit organization dedicated to juvenile justice reform. Amara didn't just talk about helping underprivileged communities. She lived among them, worked alongside them, and fought for them every single day. Her apartment wasn't in the governor's mansion or in some exclusive high-rise downtown. She lived in a modest two-bedroom in a working-class neighborhood where she knew her neighbors by name, and they knew her simply as B. Amy, the social worker who helped Mrs. Johnson's grandson get into a good school and who organized a community garden on the vacant lot. This was the life she'd chosen, and it was authentic in ways that her father's political world could never be. Tonight's gala was one of the few official events she agreed to attend, primarily because the cause was close to her heart and because her father had personally asked her to be there. As she walked toward the hotel entrance, Amara felt the familiar weight of existing between two worlds. She carried with her a clutch purse that contained her invitation, her identification, and very little else. She didn't believe in ostentatious displays of wealth or status, even when attending events where such displays were practically mandatory. As she approached the entrance, she noticed the security checkpoint and the stern-faced officer who seemed to be scrutinizing every arrival. She reached into her purse for her invitation, ready to present it with the same courtesy she showed everyone she encountered. What Amara didn't know was that Officer Davidson had already noticed her, and in his mind, he'd already decided she didn't belong. He'd seen her emerge from an older model car, noticed her simple dress and lack of expensive accessories, and in the split second of that observation, his biases had constructed an entire narrative about who she was and why she was really there. Officer Marcus Davidson's hand shot up in a stopping gesture as Amara approached the entrance, his palm facing her like a barrier. His voice carried that particular tone of authority mixed with suspicion that immediately creates tension in any interaction. "Excuse me, miss. This is a private event. The service entrance is around the back." The words hit Amara like a slap, not because they were aggressive, but because of what they implied. She'd experienced this before, countless times in countless variations, but it never stopped stinging. The assumption that because of how she looked, she must be there to serve rather than to attend. She took a breath, maintaining her composure in the way she'd learned through years of navigating spaces where people made assumptions about her before she even spoke. "Good evening, officer. I'm actually a guest. I have my invitation right here," she said, reaching into her clutch with deliberate slowness, aware that sudden movements around suspicious police officers could escalate situations unnecessarily. She pulled out the elegant cream-colored invitation with gold embossing, the same invitation that had been hand-delivered to select guests weeks ago. Marcus barely glanced at it. "Where did you get that?" "These invitations are only sent to approved guests." The question itself was an accusation. Amara felt her jaw tighten slightly, but her voice remained calm. "As I said, I'm a guest. My name is Amara Okonkwo, and if you check your list, you'll find I'm registered." Marcus's eyes narrowed. The name meant nothing to him, or perhaps it meant something he chose to ignore because it didn't fit the narrative his biases had already written. "Stay right here," he commanded, his hand moving to rest on his belt near his radio. He stepped aside and spoke into his radio in a low voice, requesting someone to check the guest list for her name. Amara stood there, very aware of the other guests flowing past her, some glancing curiously at the scene unfolding, others purposefully looking away. She could feel the heat of embarrassment beginning to rise, but she pushed it down. She'd done nothing wrong. She had every right to be there, and she wouldn't let this officer's prejudice make her feel otherwise. A few moments later, a harried-looking event coordinator appeared with a tablet, scrolling through the guest list. "Yes, Amara Okonkwo is on the list," she confirmed, looking confused about why this was even a question. Marcus's expression didn't soften. Instead, his suspicions seemed to deepen, as if her presence on the list was somehow more evidence of wrongdoing rather than less. "I need to see some identification," he demanded. Amara complied, pulling out her driver's license and handing it to him. He studied it with theatrical intensity, comparing the photo to her face, then back to the invitation, as if he were a forensic expert detecting forgery. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. "How does someone like you get invited to something like this?" The words hung in the air, their implications crystal clear. Someone like you. 3 words that carried centuries of prejudice, assumption, and discrimination. Around them, the flow of entering guests had slowed as people became aware of the confrontation. The scene at the entrance had begun to draw a crowd. What started as curious glances from passing guests had evolved into a small semicircle of onlookers, their expensive shoes pausing on the red carpet. their champagne-ready smiles fading into expressions of intrigue and discomfort. Smartphones emerged from designer clutches and suit pockets. Cameras pointed discreetly at first, then more openly, as people realized they might be witnessing something worth capturing. In today's world, everything is content, every confrontation a potential viral moment. Amara felt the weight of those watching eyes, each gaze adding another layer to her humiliation. Officer Davidson seemed to feed off the attention, his sense of authority amplifying with his audience. He handed back her identification and invitation with a dismissive flick of his wrist. "I don't care what that list says. I've been doing this job long enough to know when something doesn't add up. You don't look like you belong at an event like this." The words were no longer veiled in professional concern. They were naked prejudice dressed in a uniform. Amara's composure began to crack at the edges. Her voice, when she spoke, carried a tremor that was equal parts anger and hurt. "And what exactly does someone who belongs here look like, officer?" It was a challenge, a direct confrontation of the bias that had been implicit until now. Marcus's face flushed red. He wasn't accustomed to being questioned, especially not by someone he'd already decided was beneath his concern. "Don't get smart with me. I have reason to believe this invitation was stolen or forged. I'm going to need you to come with me for questioning." The accusation was absurd, completely unfounded, but it was delivered with such certainty that some of the onlookers began to whisper among themselves. Seeds of doubt were being planted. Maybe she really didn't belong. Maybe there was something suspicious about her presence. This is how prejudice works. It doesn't need evidence. It just needs authority and an audience willing to accept assumptions as facts. Amara stood her ground. "I'm not going anywhere with you. I've shown you my invitation and my identification. I'm on the guest list. I have every right to be here, and you have absolutely no grounds to detain me." Her voice was stronger now, fueled by righteous indignation. She'd spent her career fighting against exactly this kind of injustice, and she wasn't about to become a victim of it without resistance. Marcus stepped closer, invading her personal space in a move designed to intimidate. "You're causing a disturbance at a private event. That gives me every right to remove you from the premises." The event coordinator, a middle-aged woman named Patricia, tried to intervene. "Officer, perhaps we should just let her through. She's on the list, after all." Marcus turned his glare on Patricia. "Ma'am, with all due respect, security is my domain. I've seen every kind of scam and scheme out there. People steal invitations, forge documents, talk their way into places they don't belong. It's my job to protect these guests from exactly this kind of situation." He gestured toward Amara, as if she were Exhibit A in a criminal trial. Patricia looked uncertain, caught between wanting to do the right thing and not wanting to contradict the security professional. She glanced at Amara with an expression that might have been sympathy, but looked more like pity, then stepped back, effectively choosing inaction. The crowd grew larger. Someone near the back called out, "Just let her in already." But another voice countered, "Let the officer do his job." The situation was spiraling, taking on a life of its own. Officer Davidson made his decision with the confidence of a man who believed he was absolutely right, who believed his authority was unquestionable, and who had no idea how catastrophically wrong he was. He reached for his handcuffs, the metal gleaming under the golden lights of the hotel entrance. "Ma'am, you need to come with me. If you refuse, I'll have to place you under arrest for trespassing and disorderly conduct." Amara's eyes widened in disbelief. This couldn't be happening. She'd done everything right, provided everything requested, and yet here she was being treated like a criminal in front of hundreds of people. This is absolutely ridiculous. "You have no grounds to arrest me." Her voice cracked slightly, the emotional toll of the situation finally breaking through her composed exterior. Marcus grabbed her arm, his grip firm and unyielding. "Turn around and place your hands behind your back." The command was given with the mechanical efficiency of someone who'd done this hundreds of times. someone for whom this was just another routine procedure. But this wasn't routine. This was a profound violation of dignity, a public stripping away of humanity based solely on prejudice and assumption. The crowd gasped collectively as the handcuffs clicked into place around Amara's wrists. The sound seemed impossibly loud, echoing off the marble floors and high ceilings. Smartphones were now unabashedly recording every moment, capturing the tears that Amara tried desperately to hold back, the tremble in her shoulders, the way she held her head up even as everything inside her screamed to run. Women in expensive gowns whispered to each other behind manicured hands. Men in tailored suits shook their heads, some in agreement with the officer's actions, others in discomfort at the scene unfolding before them. A few people looked genuinely disturbed, as if they wanted to intervene but couldn't quite figure out how or were too afraid of the social consequences. This is the anatomy of injustice. It happens in public, witnessed by dozens, yet no one steps forward to stop it. Everyone assumes someone else will do something, that surely someone with more authority or courage will intervene. And so the injustice proceeds, sanctioned by collective silence. Marcus began to walk Amara toward the side entrance, away from the main event, intending to take her to a security office for processing. Each step was agony for Amara, not because of physical pain, but because of the psychological weight of public humiliation. She'd spent her entire life working to be judged by her character, her achievements, her contributions to society. Yet here, in this moment, all of that was invisible. She was reduced to nothing more than what she looked like, and that was deemed insufficient. As they walked, Amara's mind raced. Part of her wanted to scream her identity, to tell everyone who her father was, to watch this arrogant officer's face when he realized his mistake. But another part of her resisted. She'd spent years trying to be seen as herself, not as the governor's daughter. She'd worked so hard to be judged on her own merits. To reveal her identity now would feel like defeat, like admitting that she only mattered because of who her father was, not because of who she was. So she stayed silent, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks, her dignity in tatters, but her resolve still intact. The ballroom's entrance was just ahead, and through the open doors, she could see the glittering crowd, the life she was being forcibly removed from. And then, at that precise moment, everything changed. A commotion at the main entrance drew everyone's attention. A motorcade had arrived, and security personnel were snapping to attention. The governor had arrived. Governor James Okonkwo emerged from his vehicle with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to making entrances. At 56 years old, he carried himself with the dignified bearing that came from decades in public service, first as a civil rights attorney, then as a state legislator, and finally as the governor of one of the nation's most populous states. He was a tall man with silver threading through his close-cropped hair, wearing an impeccably tailored tuxedo that spoke of power without being ostentatious. His wife had passed away 3 years earlier, and since then, these public events had become somewhat bittersweet occasions. She had loved them, loved the opportunity to raise money for causes they believed in. Now he attended them as much in her memory as for the causes themselves. His security detail flanked him as he moved toward the entrance, and the crowd that had been watching Amara's humiliation suddenly shifted their attention, smartphone cameras swiveling toward the more newsworthy subject. The governor was known for being approachable despite his position, often stopping to shake hands and exchange brief conversations with attendees. Tonight was no different. He paused to greet several guests, his smile warm and genuine, asking about their families and remembering details from previous conversations with the kind of personal touch that had made him so politically successful. But as he moved closer to the entrance, his eyes swept across the scene, taking in the unusual crowd formation and the palpable tension in the air. His advanced security team had already entered to ensure everything was prepared for his arrival, but clearly something had disrupted the usual smooth flow of these events. His eyes continued scanning, and then they landed on a sight that made his blood run cold. There, being escorted away in handcuffs, her head bowed, tears on her cheeks, was his daughter. His Amara, his brilliant, compassionate, stubborn daughter, who had insisted on taking an Uber to these events rather than arriving in the official motorcade, who had refused to use her connection to him as a shield or a ladder, who had dedicated her life to serving others. The governor's expression transformed from polite public smile to something far more intense. His security chief noticed immediately, following his employer's gaze to see what had caused such a dramatic shift. "Sir?" the security chief asked quietly, concerned. Governor Okonkwo didn't respond. He was already moving, his stride purposeful and powerful, cutting through the crowd like a ship through water. People instinctively moved aside, sensing the change in his demeanor, the focused intensity that radiated from him. Officer Davidson, still gripping Amara's arm, was completely unaware of the approaching storm. He was focused on his task, confident in his authority, probably already composing the report he would write about preventing a security breach at a high-profile event. He was mentally patting himself on the back for his vigilance, for trusting his instincts, for not being swayed by a pretty face or a convincing story. This was who he was, a man who did his job regardless of pressure or sentiment. Except his instincts had been completely, catastrophically wrong. The crowd began to part, and Marcus finally looked up, irritated by the commotion that was interrupting his procedure. He saw a distinguished man in a tuxedo approaching rapidly, flanked by security personnel, and his brain took a moment to process what his eyes were seeing. Then recognition hit. This was the governor. This was the host of the entire event, the man whose charity this gala was supporting, the most powerful person in the state. And he was walking directly toward them with an expression that could freeze hell itself. The governor's voice cut through the murmur of the crowd with the precision of a blade. It wasn't loud, he didn't need to shout, but it carried an authority that made everyone within earshot fall silent immediately. "That's my daughter." 3 words. Just 3 simple words, but they landed with the force of a bomb. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Officer Marcus Davidson's face went through a rapid series of transformations that would have been comical if the situation weren't so serious. First confusion, then comprehension, then horror. His grip on Amara's arm loosened as if her skin had suddenly become burning hot. The color drained from his face so quickly that he looked like he might faint. His mouth opened and closed several times, but no sound emerged. In his 15 years of law enforcement, through every difficult situation he'd navigated, he'd never felt anything like the pure, unadulterated terror that gripped him now. The governor's daughter. He had just arrested, in front of hundreds of witnesses and countless smartphones, the governor's daughter. The ground seemed to fall away beneath his feet. His legs began to tremble uncontrollably, and he felt a horrifying warmth spreading through his lower body. In his absolute panic and shock, Officer Marcus Davidson, a 15-year police veteran who prided himself on his composure under pressure, lost control of his bladder. A dark stain spread across the front of his uniform pants, visible to everyone in the immediate vicinity. The crowd's gasp was audible. Some people looked away in embarrassment for him, while others stared in stunned disbelief at this spectacular fall from authority. The officer who had been so confident, so certain of his power and rightness just moments before, now stood trembling and soiled, the physical manifestation of his humiliation complete. But Governor Okonkwo wasn't focused on Marcus. He moved past the officer as if he were invisible, going directly to his daughter. His hands were gentle as they touched her shoulders, his eyes scanning her face with the concern of a father, not a politician. "Amara," he said softly, and in that single word was conveyed years of love, pride, and now deep sorrow at what she'd endured. Amara, who had held herself together through the entire ordeal, finally broke. She turned into her father's embrace and sobbed. her shoulders shaking with the release of all the fear, humiliation, and hurt she'd been containing. The handcuffs were still on her wrists, the metal a cruel reminder of the injustice she'd suffered. The governor's security chief immediately moved forward with a handcuff key, his face grim as he carefully removed the restraints. The clicking sound as they opened seemed to echo through the now silent crowd. Amara rubbed her wrists where the metal had bit into her skin, red marks visible against her brown skin. Governor Okonkwo held his daughter for a long moment, then slowly turned to face Officer Davidson and the crowd that had gathered. His expression was controlled, but those who knew him well could see the fury burning behind his eyes, carefully banked but no less intense for being contained. When he spoke, his voice was measured, each word carefully chosen. "I want everyone here to witness this moment, to really see what just happened. My daughter, who has dedicated her life to fighting injustice, who works every day to help those who cannot help themselves, who has a Master's degree in social work, and has done more to serve this community than most people do in a lifetime, was just arrested at a charity event. Not because she committed any crime, not because she posed any threat, but because someone looked at her and decided, based solely on her appearance, that she didn't belong." The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Many of them had watched the scene unfold without intervening. They were complicit in their silence, and the governor's words made that complicity clear. Governor Okonkwo's voice grew stronger, not louder, but more intense. He still held Amara close to his side, protective and proud, even in this moment of her humiliation. "This event tonight is about raising money for educational opportunities for underprivileged children. We're here because we believe every child deserves a chance, regardless of their background, their skin color, or their economic circumstances. We give speeches about equality and opportunity. We write checks and feel good about ourselves. And then we stand by silently while someone is judged and condemned based on how they look." He gestured to Officer Davidson, who stood frozen in his humiliation, still unable to speak or move. "This officer made assumptions about my daughter based on prejudices he may not even consciously recognize. He saw a young black woman in a simple dress arriving in a modest car, and his mind wrote a story about who she must be, about whether she belonged in this space. He didn't see her degrees, her achievements, her character, her humanity. He saw a stereotype, and he acted on it." The governor's eyes swept across the crowd, making eye contact with various individuals, holding their gaze until they looked away. "But he's not the only one at fault here. How many of you watched this happening and did nothing? How many of you saw a young woman being humiliated and decided it wasn't your business? How many of you assumed that if a police officer was taking action, there must be a good reason?" The silence was deafening. People stared at their shoes, at the walls, anywhere but at the governor's accusing gaze. Patricia, the event coordinator, looked particularly stricken, knowing she had failed to defend Amara when she had the chance. Governor Okonkwo continued, his voice now carrying a note of deep sadness. "This is how injustice perpetuates itself. Not just through the actions of those who actively discriminate, but through the silence of those who witness it and choose to do nothing." Edmund Burke said that the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good people to do nothing. And tonight, many good people did nothing. He turned back to Officer Davidson, who looked like he wanted the earth to swallow him whole. "Officer, I don't know you personally. I don't know if you re a good man who made a terrible mistake, or if this is how you regularly conduct yourself. But I do know that your actions tonight were based on prejudice, conscious or unconscious, and that prejudice caused real harm to a real person. My daughter will carry the memory of this humiliation for the rest of her life. She will remember being handcuffed in front of hundreds of people, being judged as criminal based on nothing more than her appearance." Marcus finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. I'm so sorry. I had no idea. I thought, ... The governor cut him off, his voice sharp. You thought what? That she didn't look wealthy enough? That she didn't look like she belonged? And what exactly does belonging look like, officer? Marcus couldn't answer. There was no answer that wouldn't indict him further. The stain on his pants had spread, and the smell was beginning to become noticeable to those nearby. His humiliation was complete, physical, and social. Some might say it was karmic justice, that he deserved to experience the same shame he had inflicted. Others might feel a twinge of sympathy for how spectacularly his world had collapsed. Governor Okonkwo took a deep breath, composing himself. This incident cannot and will not be swept under the rug. There will be consequences, officer. You will be suspended pending a full investigation. Your supervising officer will be contacted, and I will personally ensure that this matter is thoroughly reviewed. But beyond the personal consequences you face, I want this to be a learning moment for everyone here. We cannot claim to support equality while practicing discrimination. We cannot fundraise for underprivileged children while judging people based on prejudiced assumptions. Amara gently touched her father's arm, signaling that she wanted to speak. He looked at her with concern, questioning whether she was ready, but she nodded firmly. The governor stepped slightly back, giving her the space to address the crowd while remaining close enough to offer support. She wiped her eyes, took a steadying breath, and when she spoke, her voice was clearer and stronger than anyone might have expected after what she'd endured. My father is right about everything he said, but I want to add something important. What happened to me tonight is not unique. It happens every single day to people who don't have a governor for a father, who don't have anyone to defend them, who don't have the privilege of vindication. I was able to stand here and be proven right. But how many others are dismissed, degraded, and discarded without anyone ever knowing the truth? Her words hit hard because they were undeniably true. The crowd, already uncomfortable, shifted with the weight of this reality. Amara continued, her eyes finding Officer Davidson, who still couldn't meet her gaze. Officer, I want you to know that I don't hate you. I'm angry, yes. I'm hurt, yes. But hatred serves no purpose. What I want is for you to truly understand what you did and why you did it. Somewhere in your training, your experiences, your life, you develop biases that led you to see me as a threat rather than as a person. Those biases aren't unique to you. They're systemic, cultural, ingrained in ways that most people don't even recognize. She addressed the crowd again. I work in juvenile justice reform. I see every day how young, Black and brown kids are treated differently by systems that are supposed to protect everyone equally. They're seen as older, more threatening, more criminal than their white peers. They receive harsher punishments for the same behaviors. They refunneled into the school-to-prison pipeline because people look at them and make assumptions about who they are and what they're capable of. Tonight, for just a moment, I experienced a fraction of what they experience constantly. The fear, the helplessness, the knowledge that you're being judged unfairly, and there's nothing you can do about it. Tears were flowing again, but she didn't stop. This has to change. Not just in law enforcement, but in all of us. We have to examine our own biases, our own assumptions. We have to ask ourselves why we think certain people belong in certain spaces and others don't. We have to recognize that dignity and respect are not privileges to be earned based on status or appearance. They are basic human rights that everyone deserves. The crowd was completely silent now, many people openly crying as Amara's words penetrated their defenses and touched something real and uncomfortable inside them. She was giving them a mirror, and what they saw reflected back was not flattering. Amara turned back to Marcus, who had finally raised his eyes to meet hers. I could demand that you lose your job, that you be publicly shamed beyond what's already happened. And honestly, part of me wants that. But what would it solve? Would it change the system that created your biases? Would it help you grow and learn? Or would it just make you defensive and resentful? She paused, considering her next words carefully. Instead, I want to propose something different. I want you to spend time actually understanding the communities you've been policing. I want you to sit in on sessions at the social services center where I work. I want you to meet the young people who are trying to overcome the assumptions and barriers that society places in front of them. I want you to see them not as potential threats, but as human beings with dreams, fears, potential, and dignity. Marcus nodded vigorously, his face still red with shame but showing the first glimmer of something that might be hope. Yes, ma'am. I'll do whatever it takes. I'm so sorry. Amara nodded slowly. I believe you are. But sorry isn't enough if it doesn't lead to change. Real, meaningful, uncomfortable change. The gala continued, but it was fundamentally transformed by what had occurred. The conversations were no longer about stock portfolios and vacation homes. People gathered in small groups, discussing what they'd witnessed, what it meant, and uncomfortably examining their own biases. The video footage that dozens of people had captured on their phones began circulating immediately. By the next morning, it had gone viral, viewed millions of times across various social media platforms. News outlets picked it up, and suddenly, Amara's humiliation became a national conversation about racial profiling, implicit bias, and the way society treats people based on appearance. The headlines varied in their sensitivity and accuracy, but the core story remained. A police officer had publicly humiliated the governor's daughter based on prejudiced assumptions, and the moment of reckoning had been captured for the world to see. Officer Marcus Davidson was suspended, as promised, pending a full investigation. But something unexpected happened during that suspension. True to her word, Amara reached out to him, not with vindictiveness, but with genuine intent to create learning and growth from the incident. She invited him to visit her social services center, to meet the young people she worked with, to sit in on community conversations about policing and racial justice. Marcus accepted. He could have refused, could have hidden in his shame and resentment, but something about Amara's grace in the face of her humiliation had cracked open something inside him. For the first time in years, he began to really examine his own assumptions and biases. It was painful, uncomfortable work. He had to confront things about himself that he'd never acknowledged before. Had to recognize that his certainty about being a good cop had blinded him to the ways his actions caused harm. The young people at Amara's center didn't make it easy for him. They challenged him, questioned him, told him their own stories of being profiled, harassed, and dismissed by police officers who looked at them and saw criminals rather than kids. Marcus listened, really listened, perhaps for the first time in his career. He began to understand that the instincts he relied on were actually prejudices he deabsorbed from a culture that devalues black and brown lives. The incident also sparked broader institutional change. The governor commissioned a comprehensive review of security protocols at state events, implementing mandatory implicit bias training for all security personnel and law enforcement officers who worked such events. He pushed for similar reforms in police departments across the state, using the incident involving his daughter as a catalyst for systemic change. Not everyone was happy about this. Some accused the governor of using his position to advance a political agenda, of being soft on crime, of undermining police authority. Conservative media outlets questioned whether Marcus had really done anything wrong, suggesting that he'd simply been doing his job and that Amara should have been more cooperative. These critiques missed the point entirely, that they reflected how deeply entrenched resistance to change can be. Amara returned to her work at the Social Services Center, but she carried the weight of that night with her. In quiet moments, she would still feel the cold metal of the handcuffs, still hear the whispers of the crowd, still remember the helplessness of being judged and found wanting based on nothing more than appearance. But she also channeled those feelings into her advocacy work, speaking at conferences and community events about her experience and what it revealed about systemic bias. She became an even more powerful voice for justice reform, not despite her humiliation, but because of it. 6 months after the incident, Marcus completed his suspension and returned to duty, but in a different role. He requested a transfer to community policing, specifically asking to work with youth programs. His supervisors were skeptical, but Amara vouched for him, explaining the work they'd done together and the genuine transformation she'd witnessed. Marcus would never fully escape the humiliation of that night. The video was permanent, searchable, a digital record of his worst moment. But he chose to let that moment define not his ending, but his turning point. He became an advocate within the police force for better training, for examining and addressing implicit bias, for treating every interaction with the assumption of dignity rather than suspicion. The gala organizers implemented new protocols, ensuring that security personnel received thorough training and that guest list verification happened through official channels rather than through the subjective judgment of individual officers. They also made efforts to diversify both their guest lists and their planning committees, recognizing that part of the problem was the narrow definition of who belonged at such events. Years later, Amara would speak about that night in interviews and speeches. She would acknowledge the pain of it, but she would also talk about what it taught her about the resilience of dignity, about the power of choosing education over revenge, and about the possibility of transformation, even in the midst of injustice. She would say that her worst moment became one of her most defining, not because of what was done to her, but because of how she chose to respond. And Officer Marcus Davidson, in his new role working with young people, would tell his own version of that story to the teenagers he encountered. He would describe his prejudices, his humiliation, and his journey toward understanding. He would tell them about Amara's grace and the second chance she offered him. He would use his own shame as a teaching tool, demonstrating that people can change, that admitting fault and doing the hard work of growth is possible. The incident at the governor's charity gala became more than just a viral moment. It became a case study in implicit bias, a catalyst for policy reform, and a story about the possibility of redemption. It demonstrated that even in our worst moments, when we're exposed at our most vulnerable or our most prejudiced, there remains the possibility for growth, for grace, and for change. And perhaps most importantly, it reminded everyone who heard the story that respect and dignity should never be conditional on status, appearance, or position. Every person deserves to be seen, truly seen, for who they are rather than what we assume about them.